as we need it to be. Attendance has been taken. Oh, I'm sorry. We're good. All right, we're now good. Gary has us on track. Attendance has been taken. Councillor Chambers has mentioned that he might be a few minutes late for this meeting, but he will try to be here as soon as he can. The approval of the agenda, please, Councillor Carnot.
Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Bell, that the County of Brant Special Council Training Session agenda for December 20th be approved.
There would be nothing added to, no surprises. All those in favor? Opposed and carried. Thank you. Pecuniary interests, there shouldn't be any. Seeing none, we'll go on to number 4, which is our delegations. We have with us today our Integrity Commissioner, Melinda Monroe. Thank you for not zooming in and being here in real life, in real time. We appreciate it, and we'll let you start.
Oops, there we go. All right, everyone can hear me? Thank you all very much for inviting me down. This is the first time I think this is my third contract with you as your Integrity Commissioner, and this is the first time that you've invited me to do a training session, and I'm grateful for that, and I think it's useful. It's certainly one of the key elements of what I do as Integrity Commissioner, and as Councillor House said to me earlier tonight, I'm supposed to be his last resort, which is what I want everyone to think. I'm your first resort when you have a question, and your last resort when things get wildly out of hand, which we hope they never do. And the entire last term of council was a much calmer ride than the previous term of council. We'll just say that and leave it there. What I'm going to do, going to do tonight with you is I want it to be kind of interactive. So ask me questions. I may throw questions out to you. I know it's a public session, so nobody wants to be on the record, saying anything that they feel might get them into trouble. But this is an opportunity for education. That's why we do these things. I've divided this into 2 parts. So part 1 is just going to be walking through the code of conduct, why it's structured the way it's structured, kind of what it contains, because we usually see it arise when there's either a conflict of interest or there's a harassment situation, but there's a lot of other things contained in that code, and so I want to walk you through the structure of that. And then the second part is going to be talking more about harassment, and the reason, there's 2 reasons for that. One is we see province-wide there is an increasing number of these kinds of complaints coming from the public about their elected officials, so it's to help you think through how to avoid those situations or what happens if they arise. And in the case of the County of Brant, for the most part, the complaints I have had to deal with since 2016 have been in that harassment area. And so why don't we just kind of, do an opportunity right at the beginning of your council term to talk about what happens, how to not have it happen, and then, how to make sure that everybody gets through from the beginning to the end as competently as possible. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And any questions that you also might have that you want to put on the table for tonight's conversation. So their code of conduct. So this was, I've got it up here on my laptop. I didn't bring extra copies for everyone, but you should have had it in your orientation packages. And so in 2019, it was revised to include changes in Bill 68, but the codes of conduct across the province are largely the same. Yours starts with this really nice statement of principle, and I wanted to focus on that. So the preamble part of the code is not binding in the sense that you can't be alleged to have breached the preamble. But I like the preamble because it really kind of says what the whole thing is about. If you can comply with this paragraph, you're not going to fall afoul of any of the other parts of the code. So it talks about having a written code to help ensure that members of council and local boards and advisory committees share a common basis of acceptable conduct. And that's kind of a critical element because we will see from time to time that councillors will disagree on what appropriate conduct is. And in some communities, not so much here, you have councillors bringing complaints against other councillors because that common basis of acceptable conduct is part of what's missing. So you've tried with this code to create a common basis of acceptable conduct. And then the standards are intended to enhance the public's confidence. So what we're trying to do with the Code of Conduct, not only with respect to conflict of interest, which is an obvious confidence issue, but transparency and protecting confidential information and supporting the decisions made by council. All of those are about public confidence. And that then creates the County of Brant's elected and appointed officials operate from a basis of integrity, justice, and courtesy. And those are, if you can have this, sort of, laminated on the front of your desk, think through all of your decisions with that paragraph in mind, you're never going to fall afoul of the call of court of conduct. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to have a complaint lodged against you, because the reasons people choose to complain are often emotional and not necessarily based on, a real situation. They're reacting because something happened that they're mad about. That's what you have me for, to go through and do an investigation. So if we think about the code of conduct, structure of the code of conduct, then section 2 just describes all the applicable laws that apply to this code of conduct. So it's not just the code standing alone. It incorporates the Municipal Act, the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, the Freedom of Information Protection of Privacy Act, the Elections Act. Critically, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Ontario Human Rights Code, and the Criminal Code of Canada. So all of those things are kind of incorporated by reference into a code of conduct, which means that there will be crossover sometimes where I'm investigating something and a Ministry of Labor investigator is investigating something, or I'm investigating something and the Ontario Human Rights Commission is engaged in something, because all those things intersect. And Section 2 sets out what else applies. Section 3 just describes to whom it applies, which is council, local boards, and advisory committees. And there have been situations you probably heard in Hamilton where a member of an advisory committee was recommended to be removed as a consequence of a code of conduct complaint that led to a lot of public difficulty. And what I'm going to do in January, with Alicia's help, we're going to record a session similar to this for your advisory committees so that they can actually get similar training. And then Section 4 is the definitions. And those are important. So it defines things like advisory committee, but it defines who a child is. So for purposes of conflict of interest, we need to know who that is. It defines what county property is. So it isn't just the physical thing, the vehicles or the buildings, it's also the logo, the coat of arms. So using those images in your advertising in an election violates the code of conduct because you're using county property. What is a complaint? What is a complaint? It describes confidential information. Again, important, because complaints can be brought if you disclose not just things that were in a confidential or an in-camera meeting, but information that you receive as in your role as a counselor that might be personal information about a resident or a citizen that should remain confidential. So it's important to know that definition. It defines the word frivolous, which is again important in respect of what I was just saying about sometimes you get frivolous complaints. What is a frivolous complaint? It's something not worthy of serious consideration, of little or no importance, or due to its lack of seriousness or sense. And complaints will come in that are frivolous. Part of my job is to make that determination. Before you even hear about it, I may have already said, we're not going ahead with this, it's frivolous. So before it even becomes on your radar, I may have already seen it and made some decisions about it. It defines your official duties. And this is important again because here, especially in a small community, the boundary between your life and your official duties is sometimes a bit blurry. And so official duties are the public duties of a member, including functions performed necessary to demonstrate responsible and accountable government with respect to matters within the county or local board's jurisdiction, done for the purpose of providing good government and respect to those matters. So when you're engaging with the public via your County of Brant website or a Facebook page, which refers to your role as a County of Brant council member, or you're at the annual summer festival in your County of Brant role, you're exercising official duties for which it's possible a complaint may be brought. So if you do something in that setting and a complaint is brought, it very well may be captured by this code because of that definition of official duties. And then pecuniary interests are defined here very much the same as they are in the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. And I understand you had my colleague, John Mascarin, come and talk to you about conflicts of interest. And John is the guy. And if a complaint comes up, it's his books I go to immediately. So he was a good choice to bring down for that. And then the other definition here that I think I want to refer to it is vexatious. And that's going to come up when we start to talk about harassment. So vexatious means without reasonable or probable cause or excuse. So in a harassment situation, the behavior described as harassment has to meet the test of vexatiousness. So you're allowed to be critical of people. You just can't be vexatiously critical of them. And so we need to keep both the definition of frivolous in mind and the definition of vexatious in mind. So for something to meet the test of harassment, the behavior has to be vexatious. And so we'll get to that when we get to that part of it. their training. Any questions about any of that? There's a lot of me, blathering on and sort of reading your code of conduct. But any questions about that before we move on to the next part? All right. So Section 5 of the code captures really almost the whole content of the code in terms of what you're expected to do. So there's a whole lot of sections, and almost every complaint is going to refer to one or more of the, I think it's 16 sections of Section 5. Somebody's going to say you breached 5.2, 5.9, 5. Whatever. But summarized in one place, Section 5, you have to be honest, right? Tell the truth. Don't lie, don't omit when you know that omission is going to lead to someone having a misunderstanding. Conscientious and diligent representation. Do your homework. So the expectation is, and so your code of conduct isn't just about don't harass people and don't have conflicts of interest. You could potentially be accused of a violation of your code of conduct if you literally never showed up for meetings or never showed up prepared and made important decisions around someone's zoning application with no idea what the actual background was. You just showed up, ate your butter tarts, left. So so conscientious and diligent representation are an important part of this code of conduct. Focus on the issues, not personalities. And that's really when we see the kind of counselor versus counselor complaints that arise, it's because two counselors can't stand each other and they can't even hear the other person's argument because they're so mad because they just don't like that person. So issues, not personalities. Integrity, accountability, transparency without conflicts of interest. So, be clear. If you have a conflict of interest, declare it. If you're not sure, call me. If you're not sure, talk to your soon-to-be new CAO or one of your colleagues or your legal counsel. Don't just kind of guess about that, right? Because it's really critically important. So integrity, accountability, transparency. Tell the truth, be open. Temperate. That's a really interesting choice of language that we've chosen to have in this code of conduct. Temperate is, calm, measured, thoughtful. It's not about. There are counselors who seem to, make the big name for themselves in different communities by being angry or shouting or demanding or having a temper tantrum. One of my very good friends who used to be a counselor in Windsor, temper tantrums was his MO. It was the brand. But your code of conduct is talking about being temperate, right? So taking your time, being careful, being thoughtful, engaging politely with one another, with the public. Lawful. Now, why would lawful need to be in a code of conduct? This code of conduct requires you to follow the laws of the land, not just the laws of the County of Brant, but the laws that apply to either provincial or federal. And so, for example, we saw up in the Kingston area, counselors who were part of the convoy activity. Understandably, people, not everybody loves our prime minister, but being involved in behavior that is illegal is a violation of your code of conduct, no matter how mad you are about that. You, as elected officials, have ways of making your opinions known that don't have to violate the law. And if you choose to violate the law, which you are entitled to do so, you will have a code of conduct complaint brought against you. And then be ethical, and ethical in the broad sense, right? Ethical in the sense of all of these things put together. Do your homework, trust your colleagues, act with integrity, focus on the issues, be polite, and don't get into conflicts of interest. So the whole code of conduct is summarized essentially in this section. So any kind of questions, concerns, thoughts about that? No? All right. So if we go into that a little bit more detail, Section 5, as I mentioned, is about, we talked about no intention to mislead or to make false statements. So here's a situation, an example in which there was a counselor, this is down in Windsor again, who was really angry after a council meeting and made a kind of intemperate remark, said that, they were talking about putting in streetlights in an area that didn't have any streetlights, and he made a comment about how I hear about people getting raped in this area, and my councillor colleagues wouldn't put lights on this street. Code of conduct complaint using the word rape in that context was intemperate, inappropriate, designed to mislead, and he lost. He was found by the Integrity Commissioner to have violated the code of conduct by doing that. He apologized, said, I was just really angry and I blew my top, and as I mentioned, that was sort of the brand. So no intention to mislead or no intention to kind of overstate the case. Section 6 Accurately represent decisions. So this is related to the same issue, the same complaint that I just mentioned. Even if you think your colleagues made a mistake, they didn't do the right thing, the decision was wrong, your job is to represent that decision as a member of this county council. You have all the tools available to you in the Municipal Act or in your procedural bylaw to have a rehearing of it, to bring it back, to run on it in the next election. But you don't have the right to go out and say, my council colleagues made a wrongful decision and you shouldn't follow it. You have to accurately represent what was decided, and you have to stand up for it and act together, defend it in the community. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have the opportunity to run on and say, if we had it to do again, I would do it differently, and this is how. But you have to actually defend that decision. It's a lawful decision of the county council at that point. So transparency and confidentiality. As I mentioned, we go back to Section 5, touches everything. Section 9 specifically talks about confidential information. So confidential information remains confidential. And I brought this up when I did a bit of a Zoom meeting on ethics and etiquette when you're doing meetings from home. So back during the COVID days and council meetings were happening and you were at home, it was actually part of your duty that you be in a room that no one else could come in when you were in camera sessions. Right? It's not okay for your kids or your spouse or your neighbor to walk through the Zoom meeting that's an in-camera Zoom meeting. That confidential information must remain confidential. So the fact you're in the privacy of your own home, you need to be in the privacy of a private room for those conversations. And that will be true if you have other kinds of Zoom meetings. If information is coming to you, it's not left around. It's not the famous, leaving it in the washroom and having it stolen, or leaving it in a piece of luggage and losing the piece of luggage. If you have confidential information in your possession, you must protect it. But you also are required not to keep secret things that should be public. So you know the rules about confidential meetings and in-camera meetings. You only have certain criteria for which they can be in camera, and everything else should be public, no matter how embarrassing it is for you or the county administration. If it's not confidential, then the public has a right to have access to it. And protecting public transparency is part of the role of the Code and the Integrity Commissioner. I'm supposed to keep everything I do secret until I make my report, and then my report has to be public, and the public have to know what happened. And that we had a situation here in Brant where the deliberations on my report were held in camera, but the ultimate decision had to be made public, and no matter how embarrassing that was for the parties concerned. Conscientiousness. So we go back to Section 5 to talk a little bit about conscientiousness in more detail. Serve your constituents in a conscientious and diligent manner. Be available to them. Do your job, do your homework, read the giant reports that you get. If things are hard to understand, you have this wonderful team of administrators whose job it is to help you understand all the details. And it's municipalities, I like to say, are one of the most complex organisms or organizations that exist. So your little county here, and with your small number of administrators and your small council, are responsible to know how to do zoning, build roads, manage parks and rec programs, do the whole HR function, build sewers, think about planning for the long-term future, worry about climate change, be on social services boards. No other organization. I live down the street from Chrysler, and the Chrysler Corporation has to do one thing: push cars off the assembly line. And everything they do is pointed in that direction. Where for you, making a decision about affordable housing, and one about climate change, and one about where to build a traffic light, and one about zoning a new piece of property, each one of those could be made completely independent of the rest. And you have to manage that level of complexity. So being diligent means about understanding how complex it is and doing the work. Act to the best of your ability. No one's perfect. People make mistakes. But, actually act to the best of your ability and exercise the powers for the purpose that they were intended. I mentioned uphold the law. Respectfulness. So that comes in your code several places. So Section 5, avoid aggressive, offensive, or abusive conduct. That's specifically set out. Be temperate. Treat the public and the employees with dignity and respect. So those of you who were here in 2016 will remember that the big issue that arose was treating employees without respect. And so treat employees with dignity and respect. Recently, just before the election in Whitby, there was a hot mic moment that you probably all heard about, in which one counselor, made really offensive remarks, thinking his mic was turned off, about another counselor. She then came back to her next council meeting with a laundry list of all the times other counselors had said nasty things about her and about staff, and it just turned into a giant disaster for the city of Whitby, or the town of Whitby. So treat people with respect and respect one another, right? Act temperately. Respect the role of counsel and the rules of procedure. And I want to just pause on that one for a bit. The code of conduct gets it's like the part of the exercise, it's on the big marquee with all the lights around it. But the most important document you have for managing yourselves and your colleagues is the rules of procedure, your procedural bylaw. And again, this came up in 2016. And recently I had a few calls from people about something that had happened in a meeting. You have the rules of procedure to, in the middle of the meeting, time out, point of order, my colleague just called so-and-so such and such. That's a violation not only of the code of conduct, but also of the rules of procedure. Because your rules of procedure incorporate your code of conduct by reference. So you can bring a point of order in a meeting and get a ruling from the chair, Mr. Mayor, about whether it's a violation, and you can sanction one another immediately in the moment, rather than having me investigate 6 months later, come back when everybody's forgot what happened. So right in the moment, use your rules of procedure, your Robert's Rules of Order, put your hand up and ask for a ruling on behavior in the chamber. Use that. It's your friend. Respect employees as professionals and their independence. So your code speaks very eloquently about how many of your administrators will have ethical responsibilities to the Law Society, to the professional engineers, to the Canadian professional planners, Ontario professional planners, that might conflict with things you want them to do. And the code of conduct requires you to respect that. And their independence, they're giving you the best advice they can, and it may be advice that you don't want to hear. And there's a wonderful anecdote. It's probably apocryphal, but it's ascribed to a minister in the Conservative government that was elected in 2006. And it goes like this: the minister comes into the office and meets the deputy minister for the first time, and the deputy minister says, "Nice to meet you, minister." The minister says, "I want you to call me Fred." And the deputy minister nods and says, "Okay, minister, we've got all these things on the agenda. Here are the first most important things. Here's the next most important things." The minister stops and says, "I asked you to call me Fred." "Thank you, minister. And then we've got a meeting tomorrow, and we're going to do this with the prime minister, and then we've got something else." And the minister stops and says, "I asked you to call me Fred." And finally, the deputy minister says, "Sometimes my job is to help you do the things you need to do. Sometimes my job is to remind you that maybe you shouldn't do the things you want to do. And every now and then, rarely, my job is to actively prevent you from doing something illegal or wrong. It's a lot easier to do that if we're not on a first-name basis." And so that's what this is getting at, is that they may give you advice you don't want to hear. Your job is to take that seriously, and maybe you make a decision that goes contrary to their advice, but it's done with respect, and not because you think that they don't know what they're doing, they're incompetent, or whatever it is you might wish to think. They're competent, they're giving you the best advice they can. All right. Stay in your lane. That's sections 10, 11, and 18 of the code are about staying in your lane. Don't use county property for your private purposes, which we mentioned. Don't use county property or staff for elections. I'm sure you all had the training on that last spring. Respect the staff-council relationship and this counselor-to-council relationship. So you're a counselor for your ward. You're also counselor for the entire county. But you're not the staff person. You're not the bylaw inspector. You're not the road inspector. You're not the planner. So you have a role, they have a role. Yours is political, it's strategic, it's to make the big decisions. Theirs is it gives you the best advice that they can. So stay in your lane. You do that, you're going to avoid problems with the code of conduct. Conflicts of interest. So as I mentioned, you've had my dear friend John Mascarin come and talk to you about this. So observe the rules of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. Now, the third bullet there talks about how the public aren't experts in Section 5 of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, which goes through and says what are all the things that are conflicts of interest. Because all it cares about is pecuniary or financial conflicts. So are you going to make money off a decision? Is your property going to increase in value? Will your spouse's company, get a contract or get rich because of some decision you're going to make? But the public often think that things like close friendships well, Councillor Oakley made that decision because his really good friend was going to benefit from that. And it's not financial, but the public might still complain that that's a conflict of interest. And I get those from time to time. They call me and I spend time explaining to them why, if it's not financial, it's not going to fall to me to make a decision about it. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be transparent and accountable about those relationships you have. So what I'm talking about there, and from time to time I had visited with or spoke to your previous CAO about whether we ought to look at your code of conduct and include this. Some codes of conduct, and the Collingwood Inquiry talks about this, the difference between a non-financial and a financial conflict. So a financial conflict we describe as disqualifying. If you have a financial conflict, you are disqualified from making a decision. You can't make it, and most of the time you need to leave the room. A non-disqualifying conflict is where this decision is going to benefit my friend. Maybe in a financial way. It's not going to benefit me, but it's going to benefit my friend in a financial way. So it's non-disqualifying, but it's still problematic from the public perception perspective. So the Collingwood Inquiry talked about this, and some codes included a way to declare what we call non-disqualifying conflicts. So when the items on the agenda at the beginning of the meeting, like the mayor directed this evening, you could say, I want council to know that for an item 4.11, I have a non-disqualifying conflict, and I want the public to know this is what the issue is, and I've thought it through carefully. I know I'm going to make my decision, and I'm not being driven by the fact this is my friend or whatever. So there's a method for disclosing. It's that you are aware of it, you've taken it into consideration, you are doing your best to be conscientious and diligent, as required in Section 5, but it's not disqualifying, and so therefore you are going to vote. That's a method of dealing with those things. The other method is just go ahead and do things, and then I get the call, and there might be some engagement to get to the point where I can say, okay, I think it's non-disqualifying, and it goes away. But you can do it in advance if that's something you choose to do. So it's worth considering as you look at future amendments whether you want to talk about that. As I say, because it's come out of the Collingwood Inquiry as a best practice. Back to conflict, Section 8 is about gifts. And so in that section, you're entitled to accept food at an event that you're invited to go to, a little plaque, a gift of a negligible value, but you're not allowed to accept gifts of any kind of material value because they basically are a conflict of interest. So Section 8 describes the terms in which you can accept gifts. Section 19 is all about harassment, and we're going to spend some time specifically on that. So that's basically the things that are contained in that code. Any questions about that? So that's kind of the meat of it, all the things you're supposed to do, not do, and what might potentially arise as conflict or as violations. So questions, concerns, hypotheticals? Yes.
Councillor Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through to Ms. Monroe. Gifts. That's just for councillors. Is that for candidates?
So candidates are managed under the Elections Act, and so they are not subject to your code of conduct. Though your code of conduct, you are as election candidates, but people who have not been elected are not subject to your code of conduct. They're subject to the rules under the Elections Act.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you to Melinda. You said, I think 4 or 5 slides back, that we have to accurately represent decisions.
Right.
But you also then went on to say you have to defend them. I think I heard you say that, but I'm not sure I agree with you.
Right. Well, it's a good point. So it comes under this sort of question of political speech. By defend, I mean it defended as it's lawful. That decision was made. It is a lawful decision. You, the public, must abide by it. I may not think it was the right thing to do, but you can't say that your colleagues were they were blinded by conflicts of interest. You can't lie about the decision, the reason they made the decision, no matter how mad you are about it. You can't say, well, they're just a bunch of stupid fools, and if they knew anything, if they did their homework, if they were responsible, blah, blah. You can't do that. You can't say, well, that didn't go the way I wanted it to go, and I may run for election on it, or I may find another way to overturn it, but it is lawful, and you, the public, must abide by it.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? I have one. When you're speaking against or for something that's been passed by the majority of council, is it any different? Is there a difference between the mayor and a councillor? So if I don't vote for something and something gets through, do I, as the mayor, have to defend the council decision even more than a councillor would have to? They could speak against it, but I can never speak against it?
I suppose the public might think that ought to be the case, but you really don't have any different obligations than any other counselor, right? You're just one out of the group, right? It's, what do they call, primus inter pares, first amongst equals. So you have the same obligations and the same rights of everyone else. So you don't have more rights, nor do you have more obligations. The public may think that you ought to, but on the whole, they don't. You don't.
So I can speak to a decision that I don't agree with.
So yeah, you could say that, you know, in a future council, I'm going to use the powers that are available to me to try and get it reconsidered, or I'm going to run for election on it. But it is at the moment lawful, and we are all going to abide by it.
Thank you. Any other questions?
All right. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the process of complaints, what happens, so that you're prepared for that if you're new, and those of you who've been here before have been around this mulberry bush with me once or twice. So first thing, don't get complained about. That's the easiest thing to do, but of course you can't always avoid that. So the second step is speak to your colleague or to the member of the public with respect and try and see if you can resolve it. That's always the best thing to do, is actually to humble yourself, to talk to them. Maybe it's just bring the temperature down, and maybe you can actually resolve it. And sometimes maybe they had a point, and they actually, and you could have done something differently. If that doesn't work, if the person files a complaint with the Integrity Commissioner, they must do it within a 6-week window. So from the time that they became aware of it. So usually it's 6 weeks from the moment it happened, but it may be that they didn't learn that the violation took place. So say there was a zoning issue or something, and they didn't learn that there was a conflict of interest until a year later. As long as they bring it within 6 weeks of finding out, then they're within the time limits. And I can extend those, if for some they were in the hospital, in a coma for part of that time, I can extend the time limits to make it fair, or you were. But for the rule is 6 weeks from the time of the events, or as soon as they became aware of the events. The first thing I do is look it over, and I say, okay, this is completely vexatious. I'm going to ignore it. It has nothing to do. You're complaining about the county of Brant, but really it has to do with Brantford or the province. And so I talk to the person. I direct them, go to the ombudsman, go to wherever else this needs to go. Or if I decide that it's relevant and it complies with the rules, then I call you, I send it over, and we talk about it. This is the first thing I want to try and do is, can I help you to make it go away? And make it go away in a respectful way. So how can I help you sit down with the person who's involved and see if we can talk it out? And that's happened a few times where we've had to sit down and we've worked it out, and we have come up with either a formal or an informal agreement about how people are going to behave in the future. And that, again, is a way better way to deal with these things. You build relationships, you build trust. That person probably trusts you more after that than they might have if nothing had ever happened. So we try and do that, and the code provides for that. So there's one little wrinkle around mediated settlements. The first question I'm going to ask once we decide to do this is if you want me to mediate it. So I can mediate the settlement, and if it doesn't work out, then I carry on and investigate the complaint. Not everybody's comfortable with the same person mediating the resolution and investigating. So it is possible that we might say, no, Melinda, I want you to be available for the investigation. Let's get someone else to be the mediator. And if we can't make a deal, then you can investigate. Or, Melinda, you mediate, and if it doesn't work, then we'll get someone else to investigate. Hopefully not either of those things just because of the expense. But that is available in the code. I don't have to be both of those roles. You can decide if you think, I want to do this, but I don't want Melinda wearing both hats at the same time. So we try and see if we can get a mediated settlement. Can it be resolved by mediation? So this is just what I just said. And what we do is if there's an agreement, then we draw it up. Everybody signs, says, I promise to do this, I promise to do that. And we sign off on it. And then usually what happens is the person withdraws the complaint. And that's part of the deal, right? You don't agree to sign off on the agreement unless they withdraw the complaint. Usually, sometimes it means the complaint is it has to come forward, but it's just, the complaint was resolved and there's a public notification about that. Otherwise, we go to the investigation. So the current code provides that I have 90 days. From the time that it gets going, I have 90 days to resolve it. And there are a bunch of timelines that sort of cascade throughout that. So the complaint comes to me. If we can't get it resolved right away, I send it off to you. You have 2 weeks to get it back to me. I send it off to the complainant. They have 2 weeks to get it back to me. Again, all those deadlines can be extended for humanitarian reasons. And Then I decide from that, do I need to interview anybody? Do I need to review any documents? Do I need to review the law? I have the right to have access to any information that's available in the county. So any confidential, non-confidential, held in the offices of the administrators, all of that is available to me. I can issue summonses. I can order you to be examined under oath. Let's not do that. I don't really like examining people under oath, though I have had to do that occasionally for you. And so we can do all of that, and then I issue a report. And my report comes with basically two kinds of sanctions. I can there's either a sanction of a reprimand or a sanction of up to 90 days removal of pay, withdrawal of pay. Now, that's not a very big sanction. Neither of those are very big sanctions under your codes of conduct because you're not Toronto. Nobody's making, six figures and having or we saw in Ottawa, what was it? There were 3 consecutive 90-day suspensions for Councillor Chiarelli, which would have amounted to many tens of thousands of dollars, his whole income. So in your case, it's not an enormous sanction. The bigger sanction in respect of you is the public embarrassment of the whole situation. So the reprimand or the loss of your remuneration is important, and that's what the council votes on. But it's really the embarrassment of the complaint that's the bigger sanction in respect of smaller councils like this one. It comes to you, and you have to debate it. So, and you're debating the recommendation. You're not starting a new trial. So I'm not on trial. The councillor's not on trial. One of the amendments that happened under Bill 68 was that the councillor who used to be the case that the councillor who was accused of the violation of the code of conduct had to leave because it was considered a pecuniary conduct. Thank goodness we fixed that. So the councillor is entitled to be in the room and they're entitled to participate in the debate. They just don't get to vote on their own sanction. So they can try and persuade their colleagues. We've had the case where legal counsel were invited to speak on behalf of one of the councillors, and that's available to you, although it's not always the best option. But we're not conducting a trial, so we're not rehearing the facts. I have made a decision on the facts. All you're deciding is the sanction fair? Have I made a sanction? Is the sanction too low because you think it's a very serious violation, or too high because you think it's not that serious? And looking back at one of the reports that I did in a previous term of council, I had issued a small sanction for the violation, the primary violation, which was saying things that were racist on Facebook, and a bigger sanction for destroying evidence that I believed was critical evidence to the complaint. So I believed that the issue of tampering with the evidence was a bigger problem than the actual comments on Facebook. But council disagreed with me, felt that was unfair, and so they said, no, we're not going to sanction the councillor for that. We're just going to sanction for the issue of the racist comments. And that is entirely your choice. It's your job to sanction each other. I just make a recommendation. So I'm not the executioner, if you will. I'm just the finder of fact. So you debate that. At the end of that decision, the report becomes public. So it's placed on your website. It also goes on CanLII, which is the legal database of case law. And by the way, all of you, it's public, are entitled to go on CanLII, CANLII, search under MECO, which is the Municipal Integrity Commissioners of Ontario. And not all of the decisions, but many of the integrity commissioners across Ontario publish their decisions there. And you can go and look at them and actually see what's happened in other communities. Or I want to know if this is a conflict, you can go and search it on CanLII and see what has happened in other communities. So that's how that process goes. Oops, why is it going back? Oh,
Councillor Pierce has a question for you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, just before we get too much farther there, when you spoke of mediator, and you could be the mediator and or the investigator, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like that because there could be a conflict there. I'm trying to understand my own personal feeling. I guess I don't see anything wrong with you or with the integrity commissioner playing both of those roles. I'm trying to understand where the conflict would be there, because I look at it on the other side of the coin, I guess, maybe wrong, but to me, if it's the same person that's doing the mediating, that's doing the investigation, they may also be able to, connect fact to fact or fact to fiction within the two. So can you just elaborate on that a bit, please?
Right. In fact, I think you sort of hit on it in that last statement about making the connection between fact to fact or fact to fiction. So what we try and do in a mediated settlement, if say yourself and Councillor Kyle were having a mediation over something that one of you was thinking the other one had violated the code of conduct. What I'm trying to do in a mediation, and any mediator is trying to do, is really get your interests on the table. Why are you mad about this? Like, what's driving this? What other stuff is going on? So I might be probing for stuff that's kind of outside the scope of a narrow formal complaint, in order to see if maybe you have some shared interests that can actually bring you together to make an agreement. So I'm encouraging you to be really frank and honest and tell me the truth in a way that if I was interviewing you in a formal complaint, then it's the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You're going to tell me you're strategically thinking about what you're going to tell me in that investigation, versus I'm in the mediation trying to get you to just lay it on the table, like be as frank and open and honest as you can. And hopefully the two things are the same, but not always. And so you may think, well, I said some stuff in that mediation that my lawyer tells me I should never say in an investigation. But now she knows it. I can't disabuse myself of knowing those things that Councillor Kyle told me in the mediation room. So that may be why you would say, I told you things that I would never tell you if this was a straight up interview.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. Thank
And
you.
hopefully those two things are always the same, but we know there's lots of research and lots of, because of the mediation arbitration role that happens in contracts and courtrooms and family law, that there is that potential conflict if the mediator is also the final decision maker. So I just wanted that to be available. If you trust me, which I hope you all do, then I can do both, and I can do both effectively. But you always have the right to say, I said something in that mediation room, and I don't want the investigator to know, so we need a new investigator who didn't hear it.
Interesting. Thank you.
Whoops, I keep hitting the little trackpad. All right. Discreditable conduct, which is how it's described in the code, and harassment. And this is the tricky, we've got about 15 minutes left from the time I said I'd be done, and I think that's all we'll need. So the intersection here is between your code, which says don't harass people, don't behave in a discreditable way, and these four other things. So the Human Rights Code, the Health, which says you must not harass people on the basis of prohibited grounds. So the Human Rights Code is about race, ethnicity, religion, creed, gender identity, family status. Ontario Health and Safety Act is about a safe workplace. So the workplace of the County of Brant. And all of the people sitting over here, they're employees and you are not. So they're protected by the Health and Safety Act, but you aren't. So they're protected from you, but not you from them, in the sense of that health and safety rule. Prevention of violence in the workplace policy. So Brant has workplace violence policies, which they are required to have under health and safety law, and workplace harassment policies, which they're also required to have under health and safety law. So the CAO is required to do a whole bunch of things under that health and safety rules and under the Human Rights Code, notwithstanding whether or not there is a complaint ever brought or whether I find that you were in violation of the code. I may find, and we'll talk about this in a minute, that you are not in violation of the discreditable conduct sections of the code, but a Ministry of Labor investigator might find that what you did is in violation of the health and safety rules, and your CAO is required to make decisions and take action separate from what I might be doing as your integrity commissioner. That's why this is so thorny. So the reason I brought it up, as I mentioned, 42% of currently filed MECO cases in the database I mentioned are about harassment, and that's gone up. Last year it was only 36%. So it is increasing across the province, and most of the complaints I've managed here have been harassment related. So here's what your code says. Members shall not harass other members, employees, and individuals providing services on a contract for service, so that means contractors, consultants, students on placements, and the public, where harassment means engaging in a course of vexatious, all right, said to put a pin in that before, comment or conduct that is known or ought to be known to be reasonably known to be unwelcome. So the things you got to keep in mind, so the big group of people that you need to think about, and then a course of vexatious comment or conduct that is known or ought reasonably known to be unwelcome. So can you publicly criticize county staff for the quality of a report that they brought you And would that be in violation of this section of your code of conduct? Or potentially the harassment rules or the public safety, the safety in the workplace rules? So that's going to be our kind of hypothetical. I've just copied this right out of there for greater clarity. Without limiting the generality of the foregoing, you can't speak in a manner that's discriminatory to any individual based on the Human Rights Code criteria. Make indecent, abusive, insulting, or inappropriate comments or gestures to or about an individual where such conduct is known or reasonably known to be offensive to the person or persons to whom they are directed or about. Display materials or transmit communications that are inappropriate, offensive, insulting, or derogatory. Make threats or engage in any abusive activity or course of conduct towards others. Vandalize the personal property of others. Brackets. That just happened in Brampton, right? But or was it Brampton or Mississauga, where one of the councillors was keying the car of another councillor. Commit assault of any kind, including making unwanted physical contact, including touching, patting, or pinching, or refuse to converse or interact with anyone based on a ground listed in the Human Rights Code as amended. So that's in section A. Harassment of any person, including an employee, which occurs in the course of or related to the performance of official duties is subject to this code. So that could be down at the rink when you're there for the great playoff game and you're there in your role as a counselor and you're making offensive comments to the person that's cheering for the other team, right? You've got to kind of think about what hat you're wearing in the context and whether it meets these criteria. So it's pretty broad and it's pretty strict. The other parentheses I'll put in is you may have been reading in the paper that one of the councillors in Calgary was taking photographs of the mayor's car in the private parking lot that the councillors and the mayor used. So their integrity commissioner kicked him out of the parking lot. He now has to park on the street because he was behaving in a way that was threatening the safety of the mayor. I sometimes wonder why people run for election. So questions about that. I mean, it's a pretty big statement about the kind of things that, so you can't refuse to converse with people based on grounds in the Human Rights Code. Displaying materials, making, vandalizing properties we mentioned. So it's a pretty big statement of what you're allowed to do. So that's under your code. So those are the rules in your code. Oh, yeah, sorry, Councillor.
Councillor Bell.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Melinda, this is one-sided, isn't it?
Pardon me?
This is a one-sided story.
Yes, I'm afraid
we
so.
We cannot do this, but we can be done unto. And I'm thinking now about social media. And there are some very vexatious comments that are found on social media. To us all, I think we're all going to get it if we haven't already had it. Mayor Bailey has seen many of them. Is there anything that is reciprocal that we can use?
So you have the right, obviously, to access the Human Rights Code. So if those comments are made against you and they are based on race, ancestry, place of origin, creed, gender, sexual orientation, or sexual expression, then you are entitled to access the Human Rights Code too. Although it doesn't necessarily cover members of the public acting as members of the public in general. You're also entitled to the criminal code protections against hate speech or threatening speech. So if someone is threatening to harm you, or if the speech is such that it's leading other people to want to harm you, then you have access to the criminal code. But no, you are holding yourself to a much higher standard than the public is being held to. And it's part of, you took that oath, you ran for election, you're getting the big bucks, you're holding yourself to a higher standard.
Councillor House.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick follow-up to that. What about libel?
Well, you have access to the libel laws, and we'll talk about political speech. But if someone's libeling you, saying that you are, that you're in a conflict of interest when you're not, or that you are, a certain kind of, criminal and you're not, then you are, of course, entitled to bring legal action against them for slander or libel.
And that's not an integrity commissioner issue. That's a hire a lawyer issue.
That's a hire a lawyer issue. The only people I can issue reprimands or I can recommend reprimands or sanctions against are you. So now let's go and talk about harassment, because you are, again, this doesn't protect you because you're not employees, but it protects the employees who work with you on a regular basis. And we see this arising, and we've seen it in places like Sarnia and in Whitchurch Stouffville, where the mayor was engaging in behavior that was highly threatening to the staff. And the decisions had to be made not by the Integrity Commissioner necessarily, but by Ministry of Labor investigators to prevent the mayor from talking to staff. So if you think back to that section we talked about being diligent, doing your job, being conscientious. If you can't talk to staff because you're so terrifying to them that you feel threatened, you're not doing a good job for your community. And yet we have elected officials who engage in that kind of activity. So workplace harassment, the definition is very similar to what is in your code. Engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace known or reason that ought to be known to be unwelcome. So I asked you the question about, or I posed the question about, are you entitled to criticize the work of your administrators if you think it is not done well? And the answer to that is yes, because in this chamber you have a certain amount of protection for political speech. So you can say, I think that this report from the county planner didn't consider these things. I don't think they did a very good job. I want them to go back and do another report. That's not vexatious. It might be unwelcome, but you're entitled to actually question the quality of the work that's coming to you. But if you say, I think our county planner is, whatever, and you use ad hominem comments, you talk about them as incompetent for no reason, that is vexatious, right? You have no legitimate reason to question what you're doing. So you're questioning their professionalism in a way that is actually quite threatening and obviously would be known to be unwelcome. So you have to be careful about, you are entitled to challenge them and say, I don't think this report is good enough. I want you to go back and do it again. We're not going to make this decision tonight. This is incomplete. And they may feel that that's unfair, but you are entitled as elected officials. You must do your job under the conscientiousness rules. You just can't question them inappropriately or vexatiously in ways that challenge their professionalism that are not attached to the thing you're looking at in front of you. You don't have a legitimate reason to challenge it. Sexual harassment. Please don't sexual harass the staff. That is what happened up in Ottawa, as you probably all know, and led to some very difficult situations for people up there. So it's basically, vexatious behavior or behavior that is based on someone's sex or sexual orientation. And if you're in a position to deny a benefit or an advancement, and as counselors, you are automatically assumed to be in a position to advance a benefit to a staff person. The Human Rights Code, the definition is very similar again. So in this case, what the employee is entitled to do is either go to their employer, the CAO, or to the Human Rights Commission and have an investigation done there. I may never be involved. They may never make a complaint to me. So I'm outside the picture entirely. It's coming from another source. And the types of sanctions that the Ontario Human Rights Commission can issue are different than I can. They're typically damages. It could be money, quite a bit of money. It can be apologies, changing the workplace. So again, the harassment language is very, very similar in the Human Rights Code, only it's restricted to the prohibited grounds in the code. So what happens in an investigation? Whether it's me, whether it's the Ministry of Labor investigator, whether it's a private investigator, like an independent investigator brought in by the county, or whether it's the Human Rights Commission, harassment is primarily determined by the person being harassed, not the person doing the harassing, right? So known to be unwelcome or reasonably ought to be known to be unwelcome. So if a reasonable person thinks it was harassment, then it's harassment, even if you didn't intend it. So this is where you have to, it doesn't matter if it was just a joke. If a reasonable person would think that joke was offensive, then it's going to be considered to be harassment. Now, that doesn't mean you can't tell jokes and you can't have fun. It really means you have to think through, is this really necessary, or is there the potential that it might cause harm to someone else? And harm is actually irrelevant too. If it doesn't matter if it hurt them in a material way, it matters that it was unwelcome. And that's the determination. So if a reasonable person would consider it to be harassment, meaning it was unwelcome or reasonably ought to be known to be unwelcome, then it is harassment. So what I'm trying to illustrate with this is to sort of put all of that together in one picture. So there are two things going on in harassment law. So on the one hand, there are penalties that can be issued. And on the other hand, we're trying to protect people. So the health and safety law, the Human Rights Code in large measure, is trying to protect people. It doesn't care that the harasser gets punished. Health and Safety Act doesn't require the harasser to be punished. It requires the employee to be protected. So the CAO is saying, okay, I don't know why Councillor Garneau did what she did, but I have to protect my team. And so I'm going to lock the door. Councillor Garneau can never be alone with my staff because I have to protect my team. So on the right-hand side, decisions are being made about how to protect people. And so we've got the policies, we've got harassment investigations, we've got grievances, and the goals are to make the workplace safe, to reconcile the relationships, and to keep the culture one that is a culture of professionalism and equality, and that people are working well together. So there are decisions that are going to be being made by the staff team to protect the workplace. On the other side, you have me, you have tribunals, you have citations from the Ministry of Labor, you have courts, and we're trying to find, do we need to punish someone? So when I'm doing an integrity commissioner complaint investigation of harassment, I don't have anything to do with the safety issues. They're not asking me whether we should make the workplace more safe. All I'm being asked is, should this councillor be sanctioned? I have nothing to do with the safety question at all. The Ministry of Labor people or the CAO, they're not worrying about whether they need to punish the councillor. They're just worrying about how to make their staff feel safe. We had this happen in the investigation that I did back in 2016, where an investigator found that the former mayor had been harassing staff and made decisions about how to protect the staff from the mayor. And councils at that time didn't make any decisions at all. It was a year later, it came back. There was another incident, and I was brought back in, and all I was being asked to do was decide whether or not there needed to be a sanction. I had nothing to do with any of the questions to do with making the workplace safe. So for you as councillors, you're kind of caught in a little bit of a thorny patch there, because things are going to be kind of coming at you from both sides of that. And in terms of thinking about how to protect yourself, you need to understand, is this coming from health and safety law, or is it coming from the integrity commissioner and the code of conduct, or from both at the same time, plus there's a human rights complaint? So the basic thing to do is not have the issues happen at all. But if they do, what we're going to be doing, me as the integrity commissioner and the staff and the other investigators are going to be thinking through who's got jurisdiction. Because the other thing that might happen is I may say, well, I'm going to put my tools down until we've dealt with the immediacy of what has to happen for the safety of the workplace. And when they're done, then I'll pick up my tools and I'll start from there and decide, should there be a sanction? Similarly, if it's a criminal complaint, it might be the same thing. The police come in, I step away temporarily. The police do what they need to do. When they're finished, I come back and I pick up my tools and decide if there's a code violation, in order to make sure that we don't have a situation where I make ruling A, I say, and we saw this happen in Peterborough. Integrity commissioner said the mayor was not harassing the CAO, and the Ministry of Labor said the mayor is harassing the CAO, and then you have a problem. So, and that's what this is about. So what happens if the integrity commissioner finds there's no harassment for the purpose of the code, but someone else finds there is harassment for the purpose of protecting the staff? And so for protective reasons, the councillor is barred from having private meetings, but there's no loss of pay, there's no reprimand, there's no integrity commissioner complaint, but health and safety law still might apply to prevent you from actually engaging with staff because of whatever had happened. And so is this unfair to a councillor's constituents? I would say yes. But the unfairness comes from, you have a duty to do your due diligence. And if you're not allowed to talk to the staff because of something that happened, then you're not doing your due diligence. But you have to engage with that through the health and safety rules, and not the integrity commissioner doesn't have any role to play in that situation. I know that's super complicated. So I mentioned this before, that health and safety doesn't protect you, but it applies to protect others from you. All right, whoops. Gotta quit touching the trackpad. Before we go on to the next thing, any questions about that? Because I know it's super complicated. Even integrity commissioners scratch our heads about that.
Councillor Pierce, you first, please.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just very quickly, I'm going to go back to the analogy you were using in regards to the planner and the report and stuff like that. So if I'm understanding correctly, we can potentially make a comment about the report, but not necessarily the reporter. Is that kind of
That's
the
a
line
really
there?
great way to actually separate that. It's you can say, this report, Miss Smith, your report on this planning application is incomplete. I know it's not all there. I know there's stuff that should be there. I asked you to include this stuff and it's not there, whatever it is. But if you say, Miss Smith, you are the worst planner we ever have had, that's going to get you into trouble.
Yeah.
But if you're so as the code says, focus on issues, not personalities, right? If you're talking about the issue, you can criticize the quality of the work that's coming from your administrators, and you need to, because the last thing you want is to have bad quality work coming to you because you can't do your job if it is. But that doesn't mean that the person is deserving of abusive behavior.
Okay.
I mean, I was a young lawyer in the late 1980s because I'm about 100 years old. And in those days, throwing reports in your face and yelling at you in front of judges was standard procedure. We don't do that anymore.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
All right. So political speech. So this is getting at kind of what we were just talking about. It's criticism of municipal staff protected political speech. Are extreme political ideologies protected political speech? The answer is we don't necessarily know. And I've got a little, kind of a couple of items from the common law to talk about that. It's still kind of up in the air because there have been some councils recently where there have been really extreme positions taken, and the debate is some integrity commissioners are finding that political speech is protected and some are finding that it's not. And it really seems to hinge on the extreme ideology is okay as long as you're not then sort of somehow directing it at the personality of some other person in the room or the staff. So it's a kind of a fine balance. So, and how does the CAO municipality balance its duty as employer with protecting political speech? So what we just talked about. So, if you're focusing on the issues and not on the personalities, you're probably okay. But I know this is a bit hard to read at this distance. So this is a case from the Ontario Court of Appeal talking about political speech. So your colleagues in the legislature and in Parliament have different rights than you have. So there are old, ancient common law rules about they can say just about whatever offensive, horrible, stupid thing they want in that chamber, and they can't be challenged for it. You're not that. You don't have the same rights, and that's what this case was talking about. So elected officials are conduits for the voices of their constituents. They convey their grievances to municipal government, inform them about the state of that government. Their right to speak cannot be limited without negative impact on the vitality of the democracy. So you can come to council and say, my constituents think that this council is not doing a good job. You're the voice of that constituency. But it's not absolute, right? It's limited by the requirements imposed by other people's right to the protection of their reputation. And that's what I was talking about when we're talking about defending decisions of council. The reputation is an attribute of personality that any democratic society concerned about respect for the individual must protect. So, while municipal officials may be quite free to discuss matters of the public interest, they must act as would the reasonable person. The reasonableness of their conduct will often be demonstrated by their good faith and the prior checking they did to satisfy themselves as to the truth of their allegations. These are guidelines for exercising their right to comment, which have been repeatedly reaffirmed by the court. So if you're going to say, my colleagues didn't make a good decision here, or my colleague, whatever, is not doing, or that my staff person didn't do a good job in this report, and here's the evidence. I'm not just making this up. I actually did my work. Then that is protected political speech for the perspective of, you can't be sued for it. And if it comes to an integrity commissioner complaint, I'm going to be considering those things in the decision. So, to the extent to which you have to defend the decision and say, I might run against it, that's protected political speech. But if my council colleagues are all a bunch of idiots who don't do their work, that's not protected political speech. Is that helpful? I mean, I know it's kind of complex, but that's one of the areas where it can get a bit thorny. All right. Well, look, we're just a little bit over the time I said I would be. Sorry.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just one simple question, maybe simple. Political correctness. It's a moving feast, and one day a comment may be accepted, and in a year's time it may not be. Do you have any comment on how we should be guided?
Well, try to stay au courant with the lingo if you can, and certainly you're all out there in the public all the time. I think the best course of action is be prepared to be humble. So if you make a comment and someone says, that kind of hurt my feelings, that we don't use that word anymore, it sort of hurt my feelings, apologize. Don't let it go to an integrity commissioner complaint. Apologize and move on. How much of your identity as an elected official is tied up with being allowed to say X word or Y word. humbleness is a really good quality to have when you're thinking about things like codes of conduct, conflicts of interest, ethics. Be prepared to be humble. So just the last slide here, and I'll finish up by saying I'm staying overnight, and so I'll be here tomorrow. If people want to, if you want to actually like sit down and have a private conversation or whatever while I'm here, I'm happy to sort of hang around for the morning tomorrow and be available to people as needed or as desired. And Councillor Howes asked me for cards. In this day of the digital world, I can't remember the last time I carried my business cards, but I will make sure some cards are available, or perhaps Alicia and I could talk about that, so that you have them to, as Councillor House suggested, one of the best ways to deal with a citizen who's mad at you is to say, you want to call the Integrity Commissioner? Here's her number. And maybe they will and maybe they won't. But you're basically saying to them, I'm prepared to stand for what I just did, and I can defend myself. Call me anytime. I'm available to you. It's one of the reasons that I'm on a retainer, is that I'm ready to sort of down tools and deal with the situation here at a moment's notice. Tell me everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The last thing I want to do is, after we have made a decision and then I find out there was a whole bunch of stuff you didn't tell me, that would make me very unhappy and would make it awkward. So tell me everything. If it's simple, I might just say, oh, in the moment, do this. That's an easy one. If it's more complicated or you want to use it later on, then the best thing is we'll exchange some emails and set it up so that I'm responding to a specific set of written facts. If I do that in the code, if you get an opinion from me in writing about the situation and there's nothing that you didn't tell me that's really critically important, then that is a defense. You can actually hand it back to me when the code complaint comes and say, well, Melinda, you told me this was okay and I did what you said, so no complaint about this. So use that to your benefit, and it's the same in a conflict of interest situation. You have the same protection. So simple matters we can deal with easily. Less simple matters in writing, and that's the best way to protect both of us, if you will. So please take advantage of my services. So in the Municipal Act, I do investigations, but I'm also available for education, available for questions, and available to give you formal opinions that you can use for your benefit. So please take advantage of that. And that is it. Thank you so much.
Councillor Miller, you're first then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through to Ms. Monroe. Just going back to earlier in the presentation, and maybe this is a simple question, but I find this is the one I usually struggle with. You said if my good friend could benefit financially, I can still participate in the discussion, right? I have
That's
a non-exclusionary, I think that's
non-disqualifying.
Non-disqualifying, okay. If it's me, if it's going to benefit me financially, I'm going to step aside.
Yes.
What I don't know is where everything else falls in between. Is my wife's business going to benefit? I step aside.
Yes.
Is my offspring, my child, my brother-in-law, my father, my mother, where does, you have to help me with
Just
that.
going to pull up the very section that we need to look at.
Is there a list or?
There is. And I'm going to just hang on while I just jump on the internet and get it. I didn't bring my binder full of things. What we're looking for is the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. And it's yourself, and if you are a member of an organization that's going to benefit, so you are on the board of directors of a not-for-profit that's going to benefit. So if you are on the board of a not-for-profit that's going to get free ice time, you're in a conflict. So even you personally aren't going to benefit, you're just on the board, that group is going to benefit, it's a conflict. Child, spouse, but that's as far as it goes. So if it's your uncle, then you're not in a conflict, though the public's probably going to be cross about that. So you might want to declare a non-disqualifying conflict. If it's, your next door neighbor, it's a non-disqualifying conflict. But if your property might benefit, your family member might benefit, your child or your spouse, I think it extends to your parents, might benefit, then you are in a pecuniary conflict of interest, and an organization to which you belong. So you're on a board of a company or a not-for-profit.
Okay, but you said that's all written out in the.
It is. I just my laptop has decided not to connect to the internet, and actually, I don't need to. Sorry, give me 1 second. It's right here in my. There we go. All right, the section we are looking for is Section 5.1 of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, which says where a member, either on his or her own behalf or while acting for, by, or with, or through another, has a pecuniary interest, direct or indirect, in any matter, and is present at the meeting, shall declare the conflict and remove themselves from the meeting. And so the definition of pecuniary conflict. Oh my goodness. So controlling interest is an interest in a corporation. Sorry, that's not what I'm looking for. You think I'd have this closer to hand. Sorry? Are you looking at the code of conduct or So the pecuniary interest directly or indirectly of a parent or the spouse or any child of the member shall, if known to the member, be deemed to be a pecuniary interest of the member. So parent, child, or spouse. Or a corporation or a not-for-profit. If you have an interest in a corporation or a not-for-profit.
But not sister-in-law.
Sorry, not your sister-in-law, not your, cousin 3 times removed.
Okay.
Thank you, Alicia.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
I have one more question. What happens if you sit on a joint service with another municipality or a tri-council and a mayor or another councillor threaten to take you to the integrity commissioner, publicly screaming you're going to be taken to an integrity commissioner? Is that going to happen, or how's that work?
Well, hopefully it doesn't happen, but that is going to be a violation of their code of conduct. So if you're on a joint service board with another elected official, they have a code of conduct to which they must apply. And impugning your reputation in such a way is a violation of that code of conduct. So that's the sanction.
Thank you.
And it kind of like with lawyers, what we say, if lawyers are not allowed to say to another lawyer, I'm going to take you to the Law Society over this. That is itself a violation of our code of conduct. You can take them but you can't threaten them with it. You can't use that threat to make them do something. So don't use a threat. Don't threaten to take somebody to the integrity commissioner as a way to force them to do something, because you're going to find yourself in violation of your own code for doing that.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Councillor House.
Quick last one. If in our duties in council we witness or are directly aware of a violation of the code of conduct, if we don't report it, then we ourselves are in danger of violating the code of conduct. Is that correct?
Yes, potentially. I mean, and that happened with the incident that we talked about before with the mayor, where the incident happened on an open mic and the whole council, or not the whole council, but almost everyone overheard it. And it was my view that if you overheard it and you did nothing about it, then you were yourself in violation of the code of conduct. So if you are aware of a violation, speak to your colleague. See if you can resolve it informally. You don't have to come to me for it. I mean, just because someone's in violation of the code of conduct doesn't mean there has to be a complaint. Right. You can resolve it yourself. You can resolve it in chambers by having a point of order ruled on. You can resolve it by having a quiet chat in the corridor. You don't have to bring a code of conduct complaint. But if you are aware of something and you're not taking any action, you're just ignoring it, then it's potentially at some future date, you may find yourself in violation. And that one happened because the person that the complaint was about was a staff person who felt their reputation was being impugned publicly, and a whole council room of councillors sat there and did nothing about it.
Okay, if there's no other questions, thank you for coming and speaking to us tonight. And there is time tomorrow if you want to book some time, and you can do that through the clerk. She knows where she's staying. I let the minutes show that Councillor Chambers didn't make this meeting, but he will be at the next one, hopefully. And I assure you that this first meeting is the meeting that you're going to enjoy more than the second meeting tonight. So either go and eat or have a rest, because the next meeting is going to be a barn burner, 6 o'clock. Councillor Miller.
Moved by myself, second by Councillor Pierce, that the presentation by Melinda Monroe and the code of conduct be received as information.
Thank you. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Oakley.